Didn't They Ask Evans by Agatha Christie, Episode 4, Chapter 13, Alan Carstairs. Strangely enough, she received confirmation of this theory no later than the following day, and it came from Roger. They'd been playing a single at tennis against each other, and were sitting afterwards sipping iced drinks. They'd been talking about various indifferent subjects, and Frank had become more and more sensible of the charm of someone who had, like Roger Bassington French, travelled about all over the world. The family ne'er-do-well, she could not help thinking, contrasted very favourably with his heavy, serious-minded brother. A pause had fallen while these thoughts were passing through Frankie's mind. It was broken by Roger, speaking this time in an entirely different tone of voice. "Lady Frances, I'm going to do a rather peculiar thing. I've known you less than 24 hours. I feel instinctively you're the one person I can ask advice from." "Advice?" "Yes. I can't make up my mind between two different courses of action." He paused. He was leaning forward, swinging a racket between his knees, a light frown on his forehead. He looked worried and upset. "It's about my brother, Lady Frances." "Yes?" "He's taking drugs. I'm sure of it." "What makes you think so?" "Everything. His appearance, his extraordinary changes of mood, and have you noticed his eyes? The pupils are like pinpoints." "I had noticed that. What do you think it is?" "Morphia, some form of opium." "Has it been going on for long?" "I date the beginning of it about 6 months ago. I remember he complained of sleeplessness a good deal. How he first came to take the stuff I don't know, but it must have begun soon after then." "How does he get hold of it?" "I think it comes to him by post. Have you noticed he's particularly nervous and irritable some days at tea-time?" "Yes, I have." "I suspect that's when he's finished up his supply and is waiting for more. Then, after the 6 o'clock post has come, he goes to his study and emerges for dinner in quite a different mood." Frankie nodded. She remembered that unnatural brilliance of conversation sometimes at dinner. "Where does the supply come from?" "I don't know. No reputable doctor would give it to him. There are, I suppose, various sources where one can get it in London by paying a big price." Frankie nodded thoughtfully. She was remembering having said to Bobby something about a gang of drug smugglers, and his reply being that one could not mix up too many crimes. It was queer that so soon in their investigations they should have come upon the traces of such a thing. It was queerer that it should be the chief suspect who should draw her attention to the fact. It made her more inclined than ever to acquit Roger Bassington French of the charge of murder. And yet there was the inexplicable matter of the changed photograph. The evidence against him, she reminded herself, was still exactly what it had been. On the other side was only the personality of the man himself, and everyone always said murderers were charming people. She shook off these reflections and turned to her companion. "Why exactly are you telling me this?" "Because I don't know what to do about Sylvia." "You think she doesn't know?" "Well, of course she doesn't know. Ought I to tell her?" "It's very difficult." "It is difficult. That's why I thought you might be able to help me. Sylvia's taken a great fancy to you. She doesn't care for many of the people round here, but she liked you at once, she tells me." "What ought I to do, Lady Frances? By telling her I shall add a great burden to her life." "If she knew, she might have some influence." "I doubt it. When it's a case of drug dealing, nobody, even the nearest and dearest, has any influence." "It's rather a hopeless point of view, isn't it?" "It's a fact. There are ways, of course. If Henry would only consent to go in for a cure. There's a place actually near here, run by a Dr. Nicholson." "But he'd never consent, would he?" "He might. You can catch a morphia taker in a mood of extravagant remorse sometimes, when they do anything to cure themselves. I'm inclined to think that Henry might be got to that frame of mind more easily if he thought Sylvia didn't know, if her knowing was held over him as a kind of threat. If the cure was successful, they'd call it nerves, of course. Well, she need never know." "Would he have to go away for the cure?" "The place I mean's about 3 miles from here, the other side of the village. It's run by a Canadian, Dr. Nicholson. He's a very clever man, I believe. And fortunately Henry likes him. Oh, here comes Sylvia." Mrs. Bassington French joined them, observing, "Have you been very energetic?" "3 sets, said Frankie, "and I was beaten every time."
"You play a very good game," said Roger.
"I'm terribly lazy about tennis," said Sylvia. We must ask the Nicholsons over one day. She's very fond of a game. Why, what is it? She'd caught the glance the other two had exchanged.
Nothing. It's just that I happened to be talking about the Nicholsons to Lady Frances.
You'd better call her Frankie, like I do. Isn't it odd how whenever one talks of any person or thing, somebody else does the same immediately afterwards? They're Canadians, aren't they? He is, certainly. I rather fancy she's English, but I'm not sure. She's a very pretty little thing, quite charming, most lovely big wistful eyes. Somehow or other I fancy she isn't terribly happy. It must be a depressing life. He runs a kind of sanatorium, doesn't he? Yes, nerve cases and people who take drugs. He's very successful, I believe. A rather impressive man. You like him? No, I don't. And rather vehemently, after a moment or two, she added, Not at all. Later on, she pointed out to Frankie a photograph of a charming, large-eyed woman which stood on the piano. That's Moira Nicholson. An appealing face, isn't it? A man who came down here with some friends of ours some time ago was quite struck with it. He wanted an introduction to her, I think. I'll ask him to dinner tomorrow night. I'd like to know what you think of him. Him, yes. As I told you, I dislike him. And yet he's quite an attractive-looking man. Something in her tone made Frankie look at her quickly, but Sylvia Bassington French had turned away and was taking some dead flowers out of a vase. Must collect my ideas, thought Frankie, as she drew a comb through her thick dark hair when dressing for dinner that night. And, she added resolutely, it's time I made a few experiments. Was or was not Roger Bassington French the villain she and Bobby had assumed him to be? She and Bobby had agreed that whoever had tried to put the latter out of the way must have easy access to morphia. Now, in a way, this held good for Roger Bassington French. If his brother received supplies of morphia by post, it would be easy enough for Roger to abstract a packet and use it for his own purposes. Mem, wrote Frankie on a sheet of paper. 1. Find out where Roger was on the 16th, day when Bobby was poisoned. She thought she saw her way to doing that fairly clearly. 2. Produce picture of dead man and observe reactions, if any. And note if RBF admits being in Marchbolt then. She felt slightly nervous over her second resolution. It meant coming out into the open. On the other hand, the tragedy had happened in her part of the world, and to mention it casually would be the most natural thing in the world. She crumpled up a sheet of paper and burnt it. She managed to introduce the first point fairly naturally at dinner. You know, she said frankly to Roger, I can't help feeling that we've met before. And it wasn't very long either. It wasn't by any chance that party of Lady Shane's at Claridge's. On the 16th it was. It couldn't have been the 16th, said Sylvia quickly. Roger was here then, I remember. We had that children's party that day. And what I should have done without Roger, I simply don't know. She gave a grateful glance at her brother-in-law, and he smiled back at her. I don't feel I've ever met you before. I'm sure if I had, I'd remember it. He said it rather nicely. One point settled, thought Frankie. Roger Bassington French was not in Wales on the day Bobby was poisoned. The second point came up fairly easily later. Frankie led the talk to country places, the dullness thereof, and the interest aroused by any local excitement. We had a man fall over the cliff last month. We were all thrilled to the core. I went to the inquest full of excitement. It was all rather dull, really. Was it a place called Marchbolt? Asked Sylvia suddenly. Frankie nodded. Derwent Castle is only about 7 miles from Marchbolt. Roger, that must have been your man. Frankie looked inquiringly at him. I was actually in at the death. I stayed with the body till the police came. I thought one of the vicar's sons did that. Oh, he had to go off to play the organ or something. I took over. How perfectly extraordinary. I did hear someone else was there too. I never heard the name. It was you. There was a general atmosphere of how curious, isn't the world small? Frankie felt she was doing this rather well. Perhaps that's when you saw me before, in Marchbolt. Oh, I wasn't there at the time of the accident. I came back from London a couple of days afterwards. Were you at the inquest? No, I went back to London the morning after the tragedy. He had some absurd idea of buying a house down there. Utter nonsense, said Henry Bassington French. Not at all, said Roger good-humouredly. You know perfectly well, Roger. As soon as you bought it, you'd get a fit of wanderlust and go off abroad again. Oh, I shall settle down some day. "When you do," said Sylvia, "you'd better settle down near us, not go off to Wales."
Roger laughed. Then he turned to Frankie. "Any points of interest about the accident? It didn't turn out to be suicide or anything."
"Oh, no. It was all painfully above board. Some appalling relations came and identified the man. He was on a walking tour, it seems. Very sad, really. He was awfully good-looking. Did you see his picture in the papers?" "I think I did. I don't remember. I've got a cutting upstairs from our local paper."
Frankie was all eagerness. She ran upstairs and came down with a cutting in her hand. She gave it to Sylvia. Roger came and looked over Sylvia's shoulder.
"Don't you think he's good-looking?"
she demanded, in a rather schoolgirl manner.
"He is, rather. He looks very like that man Alan Carstairs, don't you think so, Roger? I believe I remembered saying so at the time."
"He's got quite a look of him there. But there wasn't much real resemblance, you know."
"You can't tell from newspaper pictures, can you?"
She handed the cutting back. Frankie agreed that you couldn't. The conversation passed to other matters. Frankie went to bed undecided. Everyone seemed to have reacted with perfect naturalness. Roger's house-hunting stunt had been no secret. The only thing she succeeded in getting was a name. The name of Alan Carstairs. Chapter 14. Dr. Nicholson. Frankie attacked Sylvia the following morning. She started by saying carelessly,
"What was that man's name you mentioned last night? Alan Carstairs, was it? I feel I've heard that name before." "I dare say you have. He's rather a celebrity in his way. He's Canadian, a naturalist and a big game hunter, and explorer. I don't really know him. Some friends of ours, the Rivingtons, they brought him down here one day for lunch. A very attractive man, big and bronzed, nice blue eyes. I was sure I'd heard of him. He'd never been to this country before, I believe. Last year he went on a tour through Africa with that millionaire man, John Savage, the one who thought he had cancer and killed himself in that tragic way. Carstairs has been all over the world. East Africa, South America, simply everywhere, I believe. Sounds a nice, adventurous person. Oh, he was. Distinctly attractive. Funny, his being so like the man who fell over the cliff at Marchbolt. I wonder if everyone has a double." They compared instances, citing Adolf Beck and referring lightly to the Lion's Mail. Frankie was careful to make no further references to Alan Carstairs. To show too much interest in him would be fatal. In her own mind, however, she felt she was getting on now. She was quite convinced that Alan Carstairs had been the victim of the cliff tragedy at Marchbolt. He fulfilled all the conditions. He had no intimate friends or relations in this country, and his disappearance was unlikely to be noticed for some time. A man who frequently ran off to East Africa and South America was not likely to be missed at once. Moreover, Frankie noted, although Sylvia Bassington French had commented on the resemblance in the newspaper reproduction, it had not occurred to her for a moment that it actually was the man. That, Frankie thought, was a rather interesting bit of psychology. We seldom expect people who are news of being people we have usually seen or met. Very good, then. Alan Carstairs was the dead man. The next step was to learn more about Alan Carstairs. His connection with the Bassington Frenches seemed to have been one of the slightest. He'd been brought down there quite by chance by friends. What was their name? Rivington. Frankie stored it in her memory for future use. That certainly was a possible avenue of inquiry, but it would be well to go slowly. Inquiries about Alan Carstairs must be discreetly made. I don't want to be poisoned or knocked on the head. Oh, they were ready enough to bump off Bobby for practically nothing at all. Her thoughts flew off at a tangent to that tantalizing phrase that had started the whole business. Evans. Who was Evans? Where did Evans fit in? A dope gang, decided Frankie. Perhaps some relation of Carstairs was victimised, and he was determined to bust it up. Perhaps he came to England for that purpose. Evans may have been one of a gang who had retired and gone to Wales to live. Carstairs had bribed Evans to give the others away, and Evans had consented, and Carstairs went there to see him, and someone followed him and killed him. Was that somebody Roger Bassington French? It seemed very unlikely. The Caymans now were far more what Frankie imagined a gang of dope smugglers would be likely to be. And yet, that photograph. If only there was some explanation of that photograph. That evening, Dr. Nicholson and his wife were expected to dinner. Frankie was finishing dressing when she heard their car drive up to the front door.
Her window faced that way, and she looked out. A tall man was just alighting from the driver's seat of a dark blue Talbot. Frankie withdrew her head thoughtfully. Carstairs had been a Canadian. Dr. Nicholson was a Canadian, and Dr. Nicholson had a dark blue Talbot. Absurd to build anything upon that, of course, but wasn't it just faintly suggestive? Dr. Nicholson was a big man, with a manner that suggested great reserves of power. His speech was slow. On the whole he said very little, but contrived somehow to make every word sound significant. He wore strong glasses, and behind them his very pale blue eyes glittered reflectively. His wife was a slender creature of perhaps 27, pretty, indeed beautiful. She seemed, Frankie thought, slightly nervous, and chattered rather feverishly, as though to conceal the fact.
"You had an accident, I hear, Lady Frances," said Dr. Nicholson, as he took his seat beside her at the dinner table. Frankie explained the catastrophe. She wondered why she should feel so nervous doing so. The doctor's manner was simple and interested. Why should she feel as though she were rehearsing a defence to a charge that had never been made? Was there any earthly reason why the doctor should disbelieve in her accident? "That was too bad," he said, as she finished, having perhaps made a more detailed story of it than seemingly strictly necessary. "But you have made a very good recovery." "We won't admit she's cured yet. We're keeping her with us," said Sylvia. The doctor's gaze went to Sylvia. Something like a very faint smile came to his lips, but passed almost immediately. "I should keep her with you as long as possible," he said gravely. Frankie was sitting between her host and Dr. Nicholson. Henry Bassington French was decidedly moody tonight. His hands twitched as he ate next to nothing, and he took no part in the conversation. Mrs. Nicholson, opposite, had a difficult time with him, and turned to Roger with obvious relief. She talked to him in a desultory fashion, but Frankie noticed that her eyes were never long absent from her husband's face. Dr. Nicholson was talking about life in the country. "Do you know what a culture is, Lady Frances?" "You mean book learning?" said Frankie, rather puzzled. No. I was referring to germs. They develop, you know, in specially prepared serum. The country, Lady Frances, is a little like that. There is time and space and infinite leisure. Suitable conditions, you see, for development. "Do you mean bad things?" asked Frankie, puzzled. "Well, that depends, Lady Frances, on the kind of germ cultivated." Idiotic conversation, thought Frankie, and why should it make her feel creepy? But it did. She said flippantly, "I expect I'm developing all sorts of dark qualities." "Oh, no, I don't think so, Lady Frances. I think you would always be on the side of law and order." Was there a faint emphasis on the word law? Suddenly, across the table, Mrs. Nicholson said, "My husband prides himself on summing up character." Dr. Nicholson nodded his head gently. "Quite right, Moira. Little things interest me." He turned to Frankie again. "I had heard of your accident, you know. One thing about it intrigued me very much." "Yes?" "The doctor who was passing, the one who brought you in here." "Yes." "He must have had a curious character to turn his car before going to the rescue." "I don't understand." "Of course not. You were unconscious. But young Reeves, the message boy, came from Staveley on his bicycle, and no car passed him. Yet he comes round the corner, finds the smash, and the doctor's car pointing the same way he was going, towards London. You see the point. The doctor did not come from the direction of Staveley, so he must have come the other way down the hill. But in that case his car should have been pointing towards Staveley. But it wasn't. Therefore, he must have turned it." "Unless he'd come from Staveley some time before." "Then his car would have been standing there as you came down the hill." "Was it?" The pale blue eyes were looking at her very intently through the thick glasses. "I don't remember. I don't think so. You sound like a detective, Jasper," said Mrs. Nicholson, "and all about nothing at all." "Little things interest me."
He turned to his hostess, and Frankie drew a breath of relief. Why had he catechised her like that? How had he found out about the accident? Little things interest me, he'd said. Well, was that all there was to it? Frankie remembered the dark blue Talbot saloon, and the fact that Carstairs had been a Canadian. It seemed to her that Dr. Nicholson was a sinister man. She kept out of his way after dinner, attaching herself to the gentle, fragile Mrs. Nicholson. She noticed that all the time Mrs. Nicholson's eyes still watched her husband. Was it love, Frankie wondered, or fear? Nicholson devoted himself to Sylvia, and at 10:30 he caught his wife's eye, and they rose to go. "Well," said Roger, after they'd gone, "what do you think of our Dr. Nicholson? A very forceful personality, hasn't he?" "I'm like Sylvia. I don't think I like him very much. I like her better." "Well, good-looking, but rather a little idiot. She either worships him or is scared to death of him. I don't know which." "That's just what I wondered." "I don't like him," said Sylvia, "but I must admit he's got a lot of force. I believe he's cured drug-takers in the most marvellous way, people whose relations despaired utterly. They've gone there as a last hope and come out absolutely cured." "Yes," cried Henry Bassington French suddenly. "And do you know what goes on there? Do you know the awful suffering and mental torment? A man's used to a drug and they cut him off it, till he goes raving mad for the lack of it and beats his head against the wall. That's what he does, your forceful doctor. He tortures people, tortures them, sends them to hell. Drives them mad." He was shaking violently. Suddenly he turned and left the room. Sylvia Bassington French looked startled. "What is the matter with Henry? He seems very upset." Frankie and Roger dared not look at each other. "He's not looked well all evening," ventured Frankie. "No, I noticed that. He's very moody lately. I wish he hadn't given up riding. Oh, by the way, Dr. Nicholson invited Tommy over tomorrow, but I don't like him going there very much, not with all those queer nerve cases and dope-takers." "Well, I don't suppose the doctor would allow him to come into contact with them," said Roger. "He seems very fond of children." "Yes, I think it's a disappointment he hasn't got any of his own. Probably to her, too. She looks very sad, terribly delicate." "She's like a sad Madonna," said Frankie. "Yes, that describes her very well." "If Dr. Nicholson is so fond of children, I suppose he came to your children's party," said Frankie carelessly. "Unfortunately, he was away for a day or two just then. I think he had to go to London for some conference." "I see." They went up to bed. Before she went to sleep, Frankie wrote to Bobby. Chapter 15. A Discovery. Bobby had had an irksome time. His forced inaction was exceedingly trying. He hated staying quietly in London and doing nothing. He'd been rung up on the telephone by George Arbuthnot, who, in a few laconic words, told him that all had gone well. A couple of days later he'd had a letter from Frankie, delivered to him by her maid, the letter having gone under cover to her at Lord Marchington's townhouse. Since then he'd heard nothing. "Letter for you?" called out Badger. Bobby came forward excitedly, but the letter was one addressed in his father's handwriting and postmarked Marchbolt. At that moment, however, he caught sight of a neat black-gowned figure of Frankie's maid approaching from the mews. 5 minutes later he was tearing open Frankie's second letter. "Dear Bobby, I think it's about time you came down. I've given them instructions at home that you're to have the Bentley whenever you ask for it. Get a chauffeur's livery, dark green, ours always are. Put it down to father at Harrods. It's best to be correct in details. Concentrate on making a good job of the moustache. It makes a frightful difference to anyone's face. Come down here and ask for me. You might bring me an ostensible note from father. Report that the car is now in working order again. The garage here only holds 2 cars, and as it's got the family Daimler and Roger Bassington French's 2-seater in it, it's fortunately full up, so you will be able to go to Staveley and put up there. Get what local information you can, particularly about a Dr. Nicholson who runs a place for dope patients. Several suspicious circumstances about him. He has a dark blue Talbot saloon, and he was away from home on the 16th when your beer was doctored, and he takes altogether too detailed an interest in the circumstances of my accident. I think I've identified the corpse. Au revoir, my fellow sleuth. Love from your successfully concussed Frankie. P.S. I shall post this myself." Bobby's spirits rose with a bound.
Discarding his overalls and breaking the news of his immediate departure to Badger, he was about to hurry off when he remembered he had not yet opened his father's letter. He did so with a rather qualified enthusiasm, since the vicar's letters were actuated by a spirit of duty rather than pleasure, and breathed an atmosphere of Christian forbearance which was highly depressing. The vicar gave conscientious news of doings in Marchbold, describing his own troubles of the organist and commenting on the unchristian spirit of one of his churchwardens. The rebinding of the hymn books was also touched upon, and the vicar hoped that Bobby was sticking manfully to his job and trying to make good, and remained his ever affectionate father. "By the way, someone called who asked for your address in London. I was out at the time and he did not leave his name. Mrs. Roberts describes him as a tall, stooping gentleman with pince nez. He seemed very sorry to miss you and very anxious to see you again." A tall, stooping man with pince nez. Bobby ran over in his mind anyone of his acquaintance likely to fit that description, but could think of nobody. Suddenly a quick suspicion darted into his mind. Was this the forerunner of a new attempt upon his life? Were these mysterious enemies or enemy trying to track him down? He sat still and did some serious thinking. They, whoever they were, had only just discovered that he'd left the neighbourhood, all unsuspecting Mrs. Roberts had given his new address, so that already they, whoever they were, might be keeping a watch upon this place. If he went out, he would be followed, and just as things were at the moment, that would never do. "Badger?" "Yes, old lad?" "Come here." The next 5 minutes were spent in genuine hard work. At the end of 10 minutes, Badger could repeat his instructions by heart. When he was word perfect, Bobby got into a 2-seater Fiat dating from 1902 and drove dashingly down the Mews. He parked the Fiat in St. James's Square and walked straight from there to his club. There he did some telephoning, and a couple of hours later certain parcels were delivered to him. Finally, about 3:30, a chauffeur in dark green livery walked to St. James's Square and went rapidly up to a large Bentley, which had been parked there about half an hour previously. The parking attendant nodded to him. The gentleman who had left the car had remarked, stammering slightly as he did so, that his chauffeur would be fetching it shortly. Bobby let in the clutch and drew neatly out. The abandoned Fiat still stood demurely awaiting its owner. Bobby, despite the intense discomfort of his upper lip, began to enjoy himself. He headed north, not south, and before long the powerful engine was forging ahead on the Great North Road. It was only an extra precaution that he was taking. He was pretty sure he was not being followed. Presently he turned off to the left and made his way by circuitous roads to Hampshire. It was just after tea that the Bentley purred up the drive of Merroway Court, a stiff and correct chauffeur at the wheel. "Hello," said Frankie lightly. "There's the car." She went out to the front door. Sylvia and Roger came with her. "Is everything all right, Hawkins?" The chauffeur touched his cap. "Yes, my lady. She's been thoroughly overhauled." "That's all right, then." The chauffeur produced a note. "From his lordship, my lady." Frankie took it. "You'll put up at the, Anglers Arms in Staveley, Hawkins? I'll telephone in the morning if I want the car." "Very good, your ladyship." Bobby backed, turned, and sped down the drive. "I'm so sorry we haven't room here. Oh, it's a lovely car." "You can get some pace out of that." "I do." She was satisfied that no faintest quiver of recognition had shown on Roger's face. She would have been surprised if it had. She would not have recognized Bobby herself had she met him casually. The small moustache had a perfectly natural appearance, and that, with the stiff demeanour so uncharacteristic of the natural Bobby, completed the disguise enhanced by the chauffeur's livery. The voice, too, had been excellent. Frankie began to think Bobby was far more talented than she'd given him credit for. Meanwhile, Bobby had successfully taken up his quarters at the Anglers Arms. It was up to him to create the part of Edward Hawkins, chauffeur of Lady Frances Derwent. As to the behaviour of chauffeurs in private life, Bobby was singularly ill-informed, but he imagined that a certain haughtiness would not come amiss. He tried to feel himself a superior being and to act accordingly. The admiring attitude of various young women employed at the Anglers Arms had a distinctly encouraging effect, and he soon found that Frankie and her accident had provided the principal topic of conversation in Staveley ever since it had happened. Bobby unbent towards the landlord, a stout, genial person of the name of Thomas Askew, and permitted information to leak from him.
Young Reeves, he was there and saw it happen, declared Mr. Askew. Bobby blessed the natural mendacity of the young. The famous accident was now vouched for by an eyewitness. Thought his last moment had come, he did. Straight for him down the hill it came, and then took the wall instead. A wonder the young lady wasn't killed.
Her ladyship takes some killing.
Had many accidents, has she?
She's been lucky, but I assure you, Mr. Askew, that when her ladyship's taken over the wheel from me, as she sometimes does, well, I've made sure my last hour has come. Several persons present shook their heads wisely, and said they didn't wonder, and it's just what they would have thought. Very nice little place you've got here, Mr. Askew, said Bobby, kindly and condescendingly. Very nice, and snug. Mr. Askew expressed gratification. Merroway Court the only big place in the neighbourhood?
Well, there's the Grange, Mr. Hawkins. Not that you call that a place exactly. There's no family living there. No, it's been empty for years, until this American doctor took it.
An American doctor?
That's it. Nicholson, his name is. And if you ask me, Mr. Hawkins, there's some very queer goings-on there.
The barmaid at this point remarked that Dr. Nicholson gave her the shivers, he did.
Goings-on, Mr. Askew?
How do you mean by goings-on?
Oh, there's those there that don't want to be there, put away by their relations. I assure you, Mr. Hawkins, the moanings and the shrieks and the groans that go on there, you wouldn't believe.
Why don't the police interfere?
Oh, well, you see, it's supposed to be all right. Nerve cases and such likes. Loonies that aren't so very bad. The gentleman's a doctor, and it's all right, so to speak.
Here the landlord buried his face in a pint-pot and emerged again to shake his head in a very doubtful fashion. Ah, said Bobby in a dark and meaning way, if we knew everything that went on in those sorts of places. And he, too, applied himself to a pewter-pot. The barmaid chimed in eagerly.
That's what I say, Mr. Hawkins. What goes on there? Why, one night a poor young creature escaped. In a nightgown she was, and the doctor and a couple of nurses were out looking for her. Oh, don't take me back. That's what she was crying out. Pitiful it was. And about her being rich, really, and her relations having put her away. But they took her back, they did. And the doctor, he explained that she'd got a persecution mania. That's what he called it. Kind of thinking everyone was against her. But I've often wondered, yes, I have. I've often wondered, what if said Mr. Askew.
It's easy enough to say. Somebody present said there was no knowing what went on in these places, and somebody else said that he was right. Finally the meeting broke up, and Bobby announced his intention of going for a stroll before turning in. The Grange was, he knew, on the other side of the village from Merroway Court, so he turned his footsteps in that direction. What he'd heard that evening seemed to him worthy of attention. A lot of it could, of course, be discounted. Villages are usually prejudiced against newcomers, and still more so if the newcomer is of a different nationality. If Nicholson ran a place for curing drug-takers, in all probability there would be strange sounds issuing from it. Groans and even shrieks might be heard without any sinister reason for them. But all the same, the story of the escaping girl struck Bobby unpleasantly. Supposing the Grange were really a place where people were kept against their will, a certain amount of genuine cases might be taken as camouflage. At this point in his meditations, Bobby arrived at a high wall with an entrance of wrought-iron gates. He stepped up to the gates and tried one gently. It was locked. Well, after all, why not? And yet somehow the touch of that locked gate gave him a faintly sinister feeling. The place was like a prison. He moved a little farther along the road, measuring the wall with his eye. Would it be possible to climb over? The wall was smooth and high, and presented no accommodating crannies. He shook his head. Suddenly he came upon a little door. Without much real hope he tried it. To his surprise it yielded. It was not locked. Bit of an oversight here. He slipped through, closing it softly behind him. He found himself on a path leading through a shrubbery. He followed the path, which twisted a good deal. In fact, it reminded Bobby of the one in Alice Through the Looking-Glass. Suddenly, without any warning, the path gave a sharp turn and emerged into an open space close to the house. It was a moonlit night, and the space was clearly lit. Bobby had stepped full into the moonlight before he could stop himself. At the same moment, a woman's figure came round the corner of the house. She was treading very softly, glancing from side to side with, or so it seemed to the watching Bobby, the nervous alertness of a hunted animal. Suddenly she stopped dead and stood, swaying as though she would fall. Bobby rushed forward and caught her. Her lips were white. It seemed to him that never had there been such awful fear on any human countenance. "It's all right," he said reassuringly in a very low voice. "It's quite all right." The girl, for she was little more, moaned faintly, her eyelids half closed. "I'm so frightened," she murmured. "I'm so terribly frightened." "What's the matter?" The girl only shook her head and repeated faintly, "I'm so frightened. I'm so horribly frightened." Suddenly some sound seemed to come close to her ears. She sprang upright, away from Bobby. Then she turned to him. "Go away! Go away at once! I want to help you." "Do you?" She looked at him for a minute or two, a strange, searching and moving glance, as though she explored his soul. Then she shook her head. "No one can help me." "I can. I'd do anything. Tell me, please, what is it that frightens you so?" She shook her head. "Not now. Quick, they're coming. You can't help me unless you go now. At once. At once." Bobby yielded to her urgency. "I am at the Angler's Arms." He plunged back along the path. The last he saw of her was an urgent gesture bidding him hurry. Suddenly he heard footsteps on the path in front of him. Someone was coming along the path from the little door. Bobby plunged abruptly into the bushes at the side of the path. He was not mistaken. A man was coming along the path. He passed close to Bobby, but it was too dark for the young man to see his face. When it passed, Bobby resumed his retreat. He felt that he could do nothing more that night. Anyway, his head was in a whirl, for he had recognized the girl, recognized her beyond any possible doubt. She was the original of the photograph, which had so mysteriously disappeared.